As Fernando mentioned, today we have our third topic. It is investments and focusing on regulatory treatment and regulatory incentives for investments. And people who participated in the previous sessions, they remember we started with general principles of regulation. And then last week, we discussed efficiency analysis. Now we're here in the third block, which is related to investments. And we decided just to have a special session because capital expenditures have been always in the focus of the regulation and have been also one of the topics which is really subject to most interesting and also controversial debates, how to treat them, how to encourage them on one side, and on the other side, how to ensure that they're efficient. So what Fernando mentioned, this balance, efficiency versus sufficiency, has been always accompanying the regulation and has been, as already mentioned, subject to interesting and also some very controversial discussions and debates even. What we've prepared for today is a presentation with 4 major blocks. We will start with the sector trends and investment drivers. We want to show why it's so important to look at the investment in electricity grids. And the situation in the last year is developing in a very interesting way, also very challenging way. That's why the treatment of capital expenditures, the understanding of capital expenditures, and also the integration in the price control is getting more and more important from the regulatory point of view. We want to say a couple of words about the classifications of the investments, the different way how to classify them. In this case, we selected just 2 types of classification, looking at their mandatory or voluntary nature and also at the segment where they will appear, for example, distribution or transmission/interconnection. So we want to say something about this classification, and then really to focus on block number 3, point number 3 in this presentation, which is related to the regulatory treatment, regulatory incentives. And we want really just here to describe exactly what is the relevance of the investments in the context of the price regulation, how they really reflected in the price regulation, how they should be integrated, and what is really important from a regulatory point of view just to look at, especially to ensure this balance efficiency versus efficiency. What are the schemes used? What are the methods just to treat the investments, to integrate them, to encourage efficiency? That will be subject of this session number 3. That will be included there. And then, as Fernando mentioned at the beginning, we have a couple of words at the end about the practical experiences. So we have several regulators in Europe which have been using different ways to integrate the capital expenditures. In many cases, this actually really follows the general logic of the price control models. So if the people who participated in the first session, they remember we just classified the regulation as cost-based and incentive, and then incentive regulation also, the so-called linked and non-linked methods. So these are really schemes which directly also have an impact of the integration of the capital expenditures. So that's why when we're discussing the practical experiences, we have to also just take into account the existing models for regulation and what has been used and done. And also we have an additional last slide, which is not really looking at the national, but more at the regional level or supranational, pan-European level, we can say. That's the recent initiative of the European Commission to start also looking at more specific focused way on the so-called project of common interest, which is very encouraging, because in this way we just try to, let's say, to go from national to supranational to coordinated international treatment of investments, having in mind that in many cases, especially the interconnection projects, they can have really collective benefits, not only for one country but for several. That's why this coordinated really approach is pretty important to ensure proper treatment and proper consideration, especially of the cross-border projects. And as you know, this cross-border project, international or inter-country investments, cross-border investments, they are also important from the point of view of market integration for the future electricity market in Europe. Starting with the first point, sector trends and what is driving the investment. What you see in this slide, on this slide number 3, is a simple classification of the really major trends or major developments which can have an impact on regulation and also in this case on the investments also. Then we just separated here or classified them in 3 major groups. One is the so-called political, one is technical, technological, and one is economic. The political, when we start really looking at the political trends, in the European case, they are driven strongly by the European Union energy policy, and the people who actually have really dealt with this policy, they know that is the so-called triangular. So we are looking at the balance on the one side, the liberalization in competitive markets, on the other side, really on security of supply, just reliable supply of the electricity, and then finally, which actually with increasing importance in the last years, is really the climate policy. So clean environment is getting more and more important, and that's the last actual element of the European Union policy to ensure also environmentally friendly electricity supply. So this climate policy is related to several really schemes which have been initiated on supranational and national level related to renewables, related to CO2 emission trading, related to energy efficiency. Everything is related to sustainable future and also focusing in this case also on the energy, but not only. We have similar policy also in other areas, in other industries. And then the political developments or political trends, they actually are driving directly the technology and also the economic really developments on one side. Of course, we have also autonomous development in terms of technological progress, for example, when we're discussing the technological trends. These trends related mainly to also to the future development of REST technologies. On one side, because of the need to integrate more REST technologies, again resulting from the political or energy policy requirements of the European Union and also on national level. So we have to also look at this integration, and it drives directly the technology development. So this technology is getting better and also the costs are going down. On the other side, we have not only really developments in the RES area, but also in some surrounding areas, like for example, energy storage or electric vehicles. And we have also really developments in the networks, the network technologies, electricity networks per se. So in this case, really just also these drivers, they also lead to increasing smartness, or it's called increasing intelligence of the networks, and also network components. For example, smart meters or smart grids, what is regularly just the words used in the last years. And these developments, again, they have directly implications, we'll say afterwards a couple of words about this one, on the required capital expenditures, and obviously on the regulation. And then we have the last one, which is economic. In this case, we're talking about, again, some trends or some developments which are strongly interrelated with the political and technological, but they result also really from the existing situations in the different countries, starting, for example, with the need to replace assets. It depends on the asset age, in this case in the networks, in the specific countries. And also then really just the fact that we are confronted with more and more renewable integration in the grids, which is going or which leads to changing load flow patterns and also all the associated effects, which I'll explain in a minute in the next slide. One of the effects coming from RES again is, for example, the so-called missing money problem, which means that the market price is really suppressed, they're really low, and in this case also the conventional generation start facing problems, which again accordingly may require, when you see actually discussions in the several countries at national level, but also in the European Commission, additional interventions in terms of changing market design, the so-called supplementary capacity mechanisms. We see also the increasing financial burden of RES is a fact. It's an economic really observation in this case because we can see what's going on, and also which creates a lot of political and also social noise in the countries. And again, the discussions what to do and how really just to stop that or just to mitigate this really increasing financial burden. We see also mergers and takeovers across the borders. We see also new players here involved, not only the classical energy companies, but we can see also now financial and also really other infrastructure funds getting involved also in taking over typical energy companies, even transmission companies, TSOs or DSOs. We see demand growth because of the conversion on really, or because of decarbonization on, for example, from the transport and heat sector, and also kind of really increase of the potential energy demand, the energy demand in electricity business. And we see also increasing regional trends, or regional trade. Now, if we look again a bit more on the investment in electricity grids, we can also create the following picture. We can look at the drivers on one side, and these drivers again coming from the trends which I described on the previous slides. And then we can really just see exactly the implications in the context of capital expenditures on electricity grids. And we add also one additional block on the right side of the slide. You can see the so-called potential barriers. Yeah. Starting again with the drivers, we already mentioned them. We have increasing renewable integration or generation and also need to integrate. We have potentially more demand growth for the future. It is a fact because, as already mentioned, we expect decarbonization of transport and heat sector, and most likely this can be achieved also by increase of use of electricity, and because, for example, of more electricity vehicles, because more heating on electricity basis, this actually increase of demand may require additional investments, most probably in the electricity distribution. We have connection not only of renewable integration, solar or wind, but we have also other decentralized generation, which could be also non-renewable, for example, conventional, or could be also combined heat and power, cogeneration, CHPs, which also can create additional needs of investment in the distribution grid, especially, and actually depending, I would say, on the topology of the distribution grids in the specific countries. We can see, and actually we observed already a lot of reshuffling of the merit order. This is related not only because of the volatility of the fuel prices, which actually really the major driver, together with efficiency of the generating units for the merit order, but also because of the intensive penetration of renewables with very low marginal cost. And as already mentioned, actually then the interrelated effect on the market prices. And if we see, for example, changes in the merit order, so it means we'll see also changes in the generation patterns. So in this case also the grids can, or should, we can better say should, be in the position to transport electricity which is generated in different way compared to the status quo. And as already mentioned, the asset age is the last one. Last but not least, it's also an important fact because it depends on the structure and also the age of the existing grids. If there is a need to replace, we have to replace, and any replacement also requires actually again investment. It's a replacement investment, and of course it costs money, which should be treated properly in the regulatory area. In terms of barriers, we can really find several of them. It is not the purpose of this presentation to explain every of them, just actually to list them. They can be also of administrative, legal nature, just because of the permission process, law permission process, or really national legislation. Could be structural. It's more related really just to the organization of the industry itself. For example, transmission or distribution system operators, they can also have more difficulties or less difficulties really, just in structural terms to go and implement their programs. Could be financial. It depends really on the financial strength of the organizations. Can they raise capital? quickly enough, also with sufficient volumes, and then also really respond to the need properly of these new investments. And then last but not least, actually really important for this presentation, is the regulatory area. And we can call them barriers, probably better to say just really regulatory treatment or regulatory response. And as you have seen, we have several factors, drivers, which really cause need of investments. So there should be adequate regulatory reaction in this case also, which properly also respond to this needs of investments. And when we're discussing about response, we'll afterwards in block number 3, we'll really just define what means really this regulatory response, areas of response, and areas of also regulatory incentives. Before starting with this block number 3, we promised to say something about the classification of investments. And it's important always, just as a background, to know possible ways to classify them, because this actually helps then afterwards to understand the regulatory treatment in the regulatory issues which are related to the capital expenditures. What you see here in the presentations, we just selected 2 ways to classify them. One is the nature of the investment in terms of where the investment is done. That's actually the area down. You can see cross-border transmission distribution. And there are some differences in this area. That's why we just decided also just to provide short description. And then the other one, what you can see here up in the slide, is reliability versus market-based. It is more really just the nature in terms of really, is it mandatory? For example, if we have reliability standards, we have to ensure the investments. And in many cases, in this case, we don't look explicitly at the benefits, but we look more really just to minimize the cost. And again, ideally, we can say now, if we want to really just to separate another group, which actually is really exactly the opposite, that will be the market-based investments. In this case, we're looking not in terms of mandatory investments, but more voluntary, just options, alternatives, which are interesting in terms of more benefits than cost. So obviously, in this case, these are voluntary investments. For example, could be the interconnection. And this interconnection, if it's market-based, it means that then we have to look really just on benefits which are higher than cost. We have to be really here careful in the terminology. When we say market-based, we don't want to say that really it is deregulated investment or exempted. It is not really what we say here in this one. It is just related to the fact that we're looking explicitly at the benefits, and these benefits can result from several sources. And we'll come to this point when we're discussing later the regulatory treatments in the context of so-called cost-benefit analysis, which is, interestingly, actually we can see also that increasing trend of usage, also national but also supranational level. In terms of the other classification, what I mentioned in the beginning, so it means the areas where the investments really occur, then we said we can look in 2 major groups. One is the transmission interconnection, and one is the distribution. Sometimes it's difficult always just kind of let's say to find very clear cut, because you can see especially in the areas where distribution and transmission are getting closer, that could be also not this really typical ideal patterns described here. But just what you see is more for illustrative purposes, is kind of let's say picture which is more kind of let's say I would say ideal one, just to allow us for the purposes of the lecture to go for this classification. Starting with the transmission and interconnection, you can see that it's a usually large projects and they are limited number, as compared, for example, to distribution networks, when you can see usually a larger number of projects with not so big volumes. You can see also that on the transmission network, usually longer planning horizons, and also then you can see large variability and diversity in terms of budgets, but also in terms of options, technical alternative to realize the project. so high variety. And if you look again on the distribution networks, then you can see that the planning horizon could be a bit lower. Again, I say that's the ideal representation. You can see also different and also different cases, but just for this ideal classification. And you can see also one kind of strong connection between the local realities, demand and generation characteristic for the specific distribution regions, and also really the drivers of the specific investment, as opposed to transmission, which has kind of more really regional, but actually interregional and also broader nature, because usually they have a system. I mean, they are national or even supranational. From supranational importance the investments, and because of that they have actually more than regional and actually impact in regional nature. And then compared to the transmission grid, also on the distribution level, we can say that we have a bit less what is called sometimes lumpiness. So like, let's say big chunks of really projects in terms of budget and volumes, and it's more distributed in the generation area, in the distribution area, because probably, as already mentioned, of the larger number of projects and also the individual lower financial volumes of every individual project. And what is important again in terms of regulation is what I already said, is that actually you can have two ways of thinking. Again, in ideal case, one is to say we have to invest, for example, because we have these reliability standards, and in this case, what is important is to really ensure that in this investment is at minimum cost. So it's the least cost solution in this case. The alternative one could be, so this actually is not mandatory, it's a voluntary investment, but this investment should be really commercially viable. So it means economically feasible, and in this case, the benefits should be higher than costs. So it means we have to expect net benefits which are positive. Benefits higher than cost, net benefits positive. And I'll come to this point later in the presentation when I'm describing the discussion about the cost-benefit analysis. Of course, it's important to say at this stage that actually in practice it's not a clear-cut what is really reliability-driven investment only, in this case really cost minimization, and what is market-based investment, in this case maximization of net benefits. In many cases they're together, they're really interdependent, and actually it's difficult just to find one clear way, that is to say that this investment, this is reliability, another one is market. But actually it is good just to go for this classification to understand a bit the nature, and also afterwards really the process of investment appraisal, which is important also for the regulators. Starting now with the block number 3, the so-called regulatory incentives. In terms of regulation, we said that it's important that regulators, but also policymakers, we can say here, should provide adequate really reaction and response to this really changing environment. We've seen that there are trends, political, economic, technical. We've seen that they're driving also some developments and also the associated investment needs. And we said that it's important regulators / policymakers also to provide adequate response. And there are a couple of things which should be done actually on high level when we discussing about adequate response. One, which is important, is first to ensure that the capital cost which are resulting from the investments, and we'll come in a minute what is exactly this capital cost, should be properly treated in the allowed revenues. You remember, networks regulated areas will have allowed revenues, usually set by the regulators, and in these cases also they include the so-called capital cost which result from the capital expenditures, from the investments. So it's important that this integration is really properly designed in terms of volume, in terms of time. And this is the usual dilemma, what is really now sufficient and what is efficient. Number 2, it's important also to set adequate return, rate of return. And we'll come in a minute to this again, because investments are included in the allowed revenue with the return on assets and the depreciation, and the return is one of the most really important elements, and the rate of return, which is the percentage which the investors and companies are allowed to receive on their assets, the investments, it is really fundamental in terms of encouraging them to provide funds, to find funds, and also to investments in the specific areas. One additional point related to innovation, we've seen that, actually we mentioned this one, it's a lot what has been observed, a lot of really development has been observed in the areas of the grids, also some surrounding areas like electric vehicles and also energy storage. So it seems that actually this has created a lot of attention also to the regulators, and that's why also in several cases they have really been treating and also have been looking at the investments explicitly on the innovation of the investments. And this is a trend which actually is interesting, it's important, that's why we said here should be explicitly addressed. And there are different ways how to look at this innovation. We have also a couple of points here related to especially to the innovation in the next slides. And last but not least, as already mentioned, this is the administrative barriers. These are not only regulatory issues, this could be also really in general legislation or actually others in terms of administrative barriers. Even the best regulation, if it exists, price regulation, if there are issues on the permission level or administrative really rules, how to really to conduct investments and new construction, then that's actually the regulation cannot help too much. So that's why it should actually really hand in hand this removal of administrative barriers. So far it's really dependent on the regulator. It's also an important point. Now it is a slide which is a bit explanatory, talking about the investment and how they really are integrated in the allowed revenue. So what you can see in simplified way is the revenue requirement for the allowed revenue for one regulated network provider. And we see also here on the left side the operational cost, operation maintenance cost with some components, could be also labor, material, services, could be also integrated network losses here, cost of network losses. It's one area, and we have also one really aggregated second area, which is on the right side of the slide, which is called capital cost. And this is exactly which is really the result of the investments. The investment which has been done in the years before, and they, because they're long term, they're actually not really living only 1 year. So there really this long-termism actually is reflected in the price control via two components. One is the depreciation and one is the return on assets. So depending on the regulatory framework, these two components can be done in different way, but they exist everywhere in the regulatory arrangements in the different jurisdictions. And that's why we can generalize them in this slide in this way. And then you can see that return on assets, what I mentioned, has also two additional components. It's a simple multiplication of the so-called regulatory asset base. We'll come to this point in a minute, and the rate of return. So talking about really here sufficiency and efficiency, this balance actually, what to allow as capital expenditures will reflect automatically in the allowed level of depreciation, assuming asset life for the different investment groups or asset groups. And then, of course, assuming the definition of regulatory asset base, what is included, in what is the allowed level of rate of return, the percentage, the so-called WACC usually. So this everything will drive really the portion of the capital cost which will be included in the allowed revenue. You can imagine that in this case, depending how the regulation works, investors can receive from the investment also one or another amount of money, and of course this can be a factor for the attractiveness for them to invest and to encourage the investment or not. That's why it was actually useful just to put this slide here to show the these components, and then afterwards, just to comment, when we're discussing the regulatory incentives, always to keep in mind these elements: capital cost result from investments, we have depreciation, we have return on assets, and the return on assets also is a function of regulatory asset base and the allowed rate of return. And now shortly again for the regulatory asset base, it is one of the probably most important variables in the price control, which is related to the capital expenditures, to the investments. Because really this is the basis which is relevant for the company/investors to receive money on their invested capital. And there are several definitions of the regulatory asset base. What you can see here is one simple one. We just said it aggregates the net values of the assets used to provide the regulated service by the company. Of course, it's important to say that it is a bit more complex in the practice. As you see in the graph, you can see several components which are really relevant for the regulatory asset base. I mean, the category is dynamic because we have 1 year, and then you have actually a so-called rollover for the next year, and for the next year, and so on and so forth in the future. That's why we have to really ensure that our regulatory treatment is also not static but dynamic. So that's why you can see here that if you want to roll forward one value of regulatory asset base from, for example, point number 1 to time point number 2, it means next year. So we have to look the so-called opening value, and then to look at the new investments, to deduct the depreciation, to deduct the asset disposal, which means actually assets which we'll get rid of during the year in consideration, to look at the changes of working capital and the capital contributions. Working capital is something which is not always included in the regulatory asset base. It can be included, but not necessarily. Some regulators look at this position, some not. And it is not related directly to the investments, but it is more related to some short-term assets and short-term liabilities in the balance sheet, which can have also effect of capital binding. That's why they can be included. But as already said, not all regulators really just look at this one. And the capital contribution is something also important. It is funding which is coming from third parties, could be customers, could be governments, or could be also from outside, for example, European Commission. In this case, it's a free of charge funding, and that's why it is deducted from the regulatory asset base. The classical case, for example, is the connection charges. When customers really pay connection charges, this prepayment of the customers for connection assets, which will bring them useful service for the next, for example, 20 years. In this case, this prepayment is deducted because the customers have funded and not the companies on the capital market. So you can see that here in the whole this context, regulatory asset base is very important. But as you see, really investments are really driving a lot because they always have to add to the existing assets, and then deducting the depreciation, we're moving from one to another time point. And that's how really regulation is working. And you can imagine to every of these components, there will be regulatory arrangements, and then of course these regulatory arrangements will have an impact on the level of regulatory asset base, and as already said, also on the degree of attractiveness for the investors and companies. Looking a bit more specifically at the details, I'll just try to, let's say, not to explain every single element. I decided just to put a bit more text for the people who want to look at the slides after the webinar. Happy also to respond to questions. What you can see here are the different types of regulation and their impact on the capital expenditures and the investments. And you remember in the first webinar we discussed about linked and unlinked caps, and they have also a lot of impact, the whole nature of regulation, because the linked caps, they will be looking at the prospective really cost development, so it will be explicit prospective cost planning, including the capital expenditures, and the pure unlinked caps, they'll be not looking at that. They'll start from one level of the allowed revenue and just index with the regulatory formulas, the allowed revenue. And again, the second really important point here will be again how we're going for the capex allowance or capex treatment explicitly. It could be one approach when we say capex is ex ante checked and allowed, approved in this case, usually in the context of link caps, the so-called building blocks, and it can create some certainty for the investors from the very beginning if they know that the capital expenditures have been planned, checked by the regulator, and based on kind of regulatory arrangements included in the prospectively allowed revenue. Of course, it could be also, on the other side, some incentives to inflate the capital expenditures, and that's the usual dilemma what to do, to on one side to avoid really just this inflation of capital expenditures. It means this increasing, which can be not always justified. On the other side, of course, not to discourage also investors, companies, to really go for investments which can be really important. They can be also needed, and in this case, then just to find the balance is a always important task of the regulator. To avoid the inflation of the capital expenditures and the unjustified increase, but on the other side, not to discourage proper projects or interesting projects, efficient projects. This balance is important. And the other method, as opposed to ex ante, is the other actually extreme is ex post. And in this case, if you go for pure ex post analysis, it can be done after the fact. In this case, the companies don't have really the approval or the certainty that what they're doing for the investment is already agreed and approved. But afterwards, they can always be checked. And for example, with different methods, the investments what they have done can to some extent be disapproved. So it means it can happen that if they have invested a specific amount of money in ex post analysis, this investment can appear not 100% efficient. And as already said, there are different models. The classical one typical approach to go for this ex post efficiency analysis is to go for the so-called total cost benchmarking, which has been used in some form in Germany, in Austria, I think in Norway in 1997 when the first regulatory reform in Norway. It is done actually based on the total cost. It means the existing capital expenditures, which are really part of the regulatory asset base, they are incorporated with the depreciation in return, sometimes also with a specific standardization of capex policy. They are incorporated in the efficiency analysis, and in this way, ex post, actually, the companies are compared. So possible efficiency and possible degree of exclusion are checked, or exclusion from the regulatory asset base are checked via efficiency or comparative efficiency analysis. For example, in German case, but also in Norway and Austria, it was done really with the classical benchmarking models, what we explained the last time. In this case, instead of only looking at operational cost, at OPEX, the models have also incorporated the capital cost of the existing assets in the regulatory asset base. Quality of supply is another important point because it's strongly interrelated with the reliability of the grids. It means of the investments. All regulators have been using different schemes of quality supplies, and usually we have also standards, we have incentives for quality, especially for reliability. In many cases, these incentives are financial incentives. They are linked really to the financial performance, to the revenue of the companies. The usual problems have been related to the data collection and the measurement and the existence in some countries, not always, not everywhere, in some countries of the European Union, of longer-term data series about the quality. Moving to slide number 13, we discuss about the adequate return or reasonable return. All the companies in European Union and actually all regulators are using kind of form of the so-called weighted average cost of capital, which really tries to connect together the allowed return on debt and allowed return on equity, putting also usually a standardized capital structure, and actually this all results in the allowed rate of return. So the level of this return actually is fundamental, probably it's one of the most important variable in the regulation, and it depends on several parameters here and the whole regulatory policy, how they really estimate what's the average cost of capital. It can be related to the allowed equity return, it can be related to the allowed debt return, or to the capital structure, and because all these models are using the so-called capital asset pricing model, so as a basis to determine, for example, the equity return, again, this discussion, what is the adequate level of equity return, for example, goes much further and goes to what is really the so-called beta coefficient, what is really the level of market risk premium, the risk-free rate of return. So it's getting really very financial. But it's important to say that it is important, it's essential just to establish market-based return which is attractive for the investors. That's why it's here also part of the really these parameters of regulation which have a significant impact on the capital expenditures. Revenue drivers and quantity adjustments. These are elements which are part of the regulatory formulas. In many cases, companies can receive more money if regulatory revenue formulas include the so-called physical drivers. I mean, that's the case, for example, in Norway, it was in 97, that's the case now in the current regulation in Germany. We see also this actually in Portugal, similar arrangements, and several Central Eastern European countries. In this case, what is going on is that the revenue can really be adjusted during the price control period if some physical drivers, for example, number of consumers, could be energy distributed or something else, they change. And it creates more incentives, for example, for the companies because the revenue is reflected this change, and also this change ideally actually should be significant in terms of really changes of the revenue side. So these physical quantities or physical parameters, physical drivers, they should be ideally very well correlated with the allowed revenue. And in this way, actually, just to allow that the company receive more money because they incur additional costs, including investments, if there is a change of these physical really parameters. Asset valuation, it is one of the really major aspects. Again, it's a long topic here. It is, you can imagine that's a fundamental one because via the policy of asset evaluation or asset valuation or re-evaluation, we actually really determine the level of the regulatory asset base. Remember, regulatory asset base is in simple terms the net asset value of the assets which are used to provide a regulated service, and it depends on the quantities of these assets, how many kilometers, for example, networks we have, or transformers, or something else, and on the other side, of course, what is the value of these assets. And they can be very different regulatory treatments also how to value this one. Ideally, we can say we can distinguish between two types of concepts, just for illustrative purposes. One is also called operating capital maintenance, and the other one is also called really financial capital maintenance. The first one is related actually to approaches which are based on the replacement cost for asset valuation in using also a real rate of return on assets. And the second one, the so-called financial capital maintenance, it is related to approaches which are more based on historic cost, so without really more adjusting the assets for inflation. However, in the same time using nominal rates of return. So in this case, in the second group, financial capital maintenance, the inflation is included in the return. We're keeping historic value of the assets. And the first one, operating capital maintenance, the inflation is more on the asset side. We're keeping also a real definition of the rate of return. But again, very important, essential topic, pretty complex in its nature, and could be also very, also can have a very significant impact of the regulatory asset base and of course on the depreciation in the allowed return. The same is for construction work in progress. These are the assets which really used or will be used, but currently not really activated, not still actually in construction. And in this case, regulation can allow that in different forms. So it means the companies will receive return on this money even before the assets are put into operation. And the other extreme actually could be a regulation which disallows really inclusion of construction work in progress in the regulatory asset base. So it means which is a regulation which will say, no, these assets do not bring useful service to the consumers, they will not receive any really return, and that's why they are not part of the regulatory asset base. So you can imagine that depending how really the regulation works and how the construction work in progress is treated, it can be also really encouraging or discouraging also investors and investments. And last but not least, innovation. I mentioned this one also in the previous slides. On the previous slides when I was explaining, it is important point, especially in the new developments, in the context of the new developments. And there are different ways how to, let's say, give some credits to the innovation, how to encourage innovation. And obviously, if innovation is in the area of the investments and investments are regulated, regulator can have a really here a big impact with its regulatory policy. You can see here we listed a couple of them. I mean, it could be also that innovative investments can receive the so-called WACC markup, so a bit additional return on them. It can be that they can be excluded temporarily, for example, from the efficiency analysis to encourage that these investments are really conducted, that there is a more thinking in this direction. Could be also some specific really binding standards for this actually, this investment. Could be explicit innovation, specific allowances for this investment, specific money for that. So there could be different ways. What's important is that via the regulatory policy, the regulator is trying to encourage these investments and just to bring them from this area when actually today they're innovative, tomorrow they're actually getting really conventional. So it means it's already kind of, let's say, business as usual. So this kind of, let's say, really support, which is important to encourage the thinking, to encourage the action of the company, just because the regulator or government policymakers believe it is important to go for this research. This is actually their benefits interrelated with this research, and they want to encourage it. What you see in the slide number 14, actually, it is related again to something on the investment appraisal. The regulators, as already said, they are usually confronted with the questions whether one investment is feasible or not, and is it a good, efficient investment or not. And there are different really tools which can be used, and they're well known to experts, regulators, and also companies, everyone. They are related to how really just we're checking the investment time of really these checks and reviews. The methods we discussed last time, several methods also for efficiency analysis. There are several specific models how to really appraise investments with a deterministic and also stochastic approaches to net present value Monte Carlo, internal rate of return, or different types of combination of these models. The scope, it could be just the investment, could be also really more integral the scope, as described, for example, this efficiency analysis which is done in Germany and in other countries, which includes total cost. Even actually could be the so-called SOTEX approach, the so-called social cost, in this case incorporated not only the classical supply cost, but looking also at the cost of electricity outages. So in this case, we're creating the total social really cost, supply cost, capital, and operating cost, together with the cost of outages equal to social cost. And the orientation could be also, every project could be really program specific, so more integral, as already said, or as in the case, as already mentioned, this efficiency analysis, everything what has been done, not only the investment last year, but this 20 years ago is included in one analysis and actually really is integral part of the benchmarking. And the objectives, what is important here with these all tools, it's important really just to look first, what is the adequate level? Usually actually that's a reliability issue. What is the adequate level of the investment, for example, the networks in this case? How to really achieve this at least cost or with the best alternative, which means with the net maximal benefits. And then once we have really determined and established really the good projects, which are necessary for adequate and also really efficient, then level, we have to see how to recover this efficient cost actually in the regulatory price control model. So it means it is a method, again, what we've just been discussing, the so-called integration of this cost in the price control. So if the project is good, actually is efficient, then this perceived efficient cost should be somehow transferred in the price control and allowed in the network charges. So the company should be in the position to recover this efficient cost via their regulatory charges. And last but not least, very important, as already said, not all projects are national, so we have several projects which are supranational, they are supra-regional, so in the classical cases the interconnection, and in these cases we need regional coordination, so it will be not only national perspective, but will be actually the perspective of the region. 2, 3, 4 countries should really look together, and the regulatory authorities, in order just to have really the full picture of the full impact of this specific project, not only in one country, but in several countries, and also on several stakeholders. And having said that, exactly that the next slide is the so-called cost-benefit analysis. We have seen the increasing importance and the increasing use. Actually, the theory is actually an old one. It has been traditionally used in several really public decisions, in several projects, also the development banks in the past. Now we can see that really just is again getting more and more used and popular. And what we're discussing here about cost-benefit analysis is kind of, let's say, a tool, is a scheme, is a methodology, how, let's say, to address all possible benefits, could be economic, social, environmental, of a specific project, and then just to see the project impact in terms of incremental benefits and incremental cost, and to provide a framework for decision making. So in this case, what we're looking is really just if we have a project or project alternatives, we're looking, for example, in this case, what I've shown in the slide is what are the incremental benefits. So it means the additional benefits which are coming from the project. What are the incremental costs? Obviously, this is an investment and the additional operating cost. Then we put them together in a framework, and actually this dynamic framework, for example, using net present value, and then we see whether over the long or asset life period of this project, so in this case, we have more benefits than cost. If it is so, we have a positive case, so it's a beneficial project, and in this case, it is good really just to support this one. That's actually the framework of the cost-benefit analysis. Of course, if we start really looking at the details, it can be very technical. Happy to respond to some questions to this one. Is especially related to how to estimate the benefits, which are the sources of benefits, especially, for example, on the network projects. Usually, we're looking at the so-called really market integration or price convergence, security of supply could be interesting benefits, environmental benefits could be very also important. So this actually estimation of the level of benefits also, and they're really splitting between different stakeholders, for example, producers or consumers or the TSOs, especially for the interconnection projects, and the impact on the so-called consumer, producer, and TSO surpluses. That's a very interesting and very technical topic. As already said, happy to respond to this one if there are questions. And then last block, before we just finish here, we said that we have experiences indeed. You can see on slide number 17, several countries what they have been doing actually in terms of regulatory treatments of capital expenditures. You have several countries using the unlinked caps or partially unlinked caps, I must say, because they a bit there are some linking kind of linked elements, but the approach is unlinked. We have other countries like Ireland, UK, Finland. They've been using traditionally the so-called building blocks, which more linked caps. You can have also investment allowances which are explicit, like the case in Germany, Austria, with specific investment budgets. You can have also WACC markups in Austria, Italy, especially for the innovative investments in Italy, for example. Asset valuation is very different in different countries, and as already mentioned, usually goes to one or other concept, financial capital maintenance, operating capital maintenance, and is usually well synchronized with the definition of the allowed rate of return. Again, the same is with construction work in progress. It is very widely between the countries. Revenue drivers have been used indeed in several countries in several regulatory specification of the formulas for the allowed revenue. You can see examples here. Just we mentioned Germany, UK, Austria, and again, innovation has been really used very strongly in UK. We have a specific really framework in innovation we discussed last time, I think, on the first webinar, the RIO revenue innovation incentives and output, the new model actually, which was really just introduced in UK, which is really providing strong focus also on the innovation. And we see this trend coming also this trend is coming also to the other regulators. Discussions have been also observed in several countries, including Germany, but also others, what to do with the innovation and just to provide more stronger explicit regulatory focus on this innovation. And now last slide, actually I mentioned that it is not the whole discussion about CapEx appraisal and CapEx treatment, CapEx incentives is not only on national level, but also on the supranational or supra-regional level. And what you see here is the one really very positive example of the recent European Union policy, the resulting so-called Trans-European Energy Infrastructure package, and also the idea and also the decision of the European Union to encourage the so-called project of common interest. These are projects which are relevant or beneficial not only for one, but at least for two members. And you can imagine this is a framework which aims to improve, on one side, the coordination in terms of appraisal and treatment of capital expenditures on one side. So it means at the appraisal stage, order to support the coordinated thinking, not the national, but supranational, the regional thinking. And on the other side, also to provide really a framework how to go for this really appraisal. And again, in this case, cost-benefit analysis has been part of this framework, how to really just to go for this coordinated appraisal process. And last but not least, just to provide financial funding for some projects which appear as interesting and also can be beneficial for the community. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Konstantin. It's been a great session today with a strong link to what's going on, especially in Europe. Okay, excellent. So now I would invite our audience to please provide the feedback and especially to submit your questions. In the meanwhile, I would have some questions already. Konstantin, I think I hear a small echo. I don't know if you muted properly, computer. Okay. So meanwhile, let me just send the questions forward. So the first question would be about transmission system operators. I heard that some of them have limited annual budget allocation. So they basically try to accommodate as many projects as possible within such budget. So the question is whether you are aware of such limitation, so if my understanding is correct, and what would be the reason for such a limit? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, Fernando, this way. You can imagine that if you have a capital expenditures or investment program, in this case, there are two sides. One is the company should really find the capital to finance it. And then, on the other side, of course, in the process just of their decision making, they have to be confident that the regulation is adequate and working properly. Yeah? There are two things here. And it can be also, this can be interrelated, that actually a company can have a difficulty to find really financing if the regulation is not really adequate in their perception. Yeah. Now, in terms of, let's say, a limited annual budget, I don't know whether it's called better just to say allocation, but actually every company has kind of, let's say, financial capabilities, and actually then there is a capital investment program which is driven in many cases of the factors that I explained in the presentation. Now they have to find the funding, and just to ensure that. And yes, I've seen also, we've done recently study actually in the, for several transmission system operators. It's not in the area of investments, but we've seen that actually that they have very, very large investment programs. Yeah. So it means that also if you look at the N2E really publications, the 10 years network development plan, you can see also some really great amounts of money which are planned to be invested in the next 10 years. And also I've heard that some transmission system operators have issues in terms of really mobilizing this amount of capital.
Mm-hmm.
What could be that, Fernando, the reason, I mean, could be controversial, the reasons, because sometimes, for example, the companies don't especially some operators in Central Eastern Europe, they cannot really have the financial capacity to mobilize really large amount of money at this time point. Could be also, as already said, sometimes organizational reasons, because in some cases the unbundling can have also an impact in terms of capital mobilization. Could be also another nature. Yeah?
Okay, good. So that was to some extent the sense of my second question on whether regulatory measures suffice to attract the required capital to make happen the network upgrades, especially, well, those planned in the next 10 years due to massive introduction of renewables. So whether there is another bottleneck to attract capital beyond regulation, and what could be the concerns of investors about the expected profitability of the electricity networks in the years to come. So I think you provided almost completely the answer. If you want to complete with some aspects, otherwise I think it's been answered.
Fernando, actually, as you say, I mean, it was a couple of things which are related, in addition to regulation, have been provided, I think, in the slide 2 or 3. You can see them in the beginning, factors which can have the so-called barriers. Not only regulation is important, they have several additional factors which have a role here. And definitely, I mean, the regulation has a really big role here. What is called profitability, it's absolutely important because it's exactly the discussion about the allowed rate of return. And I think it's one of the most essential variables which is set by the regulation in the countries. What is the allowed rate of return for the investments? And of course, it's a big driver also for the future investments. Yeah, that's actually regulation. But not only regulation has a big role here. Regulation for sure, but we have some additional factors.
Okay, good. So we have another question. What methods can be used to assess external costs? Can you give references to specific samples of or cases of application?
Yes, I mean it's important actually. That's one of the really major topics, the external cost. It is related to the cost-benefit analysis especially, and you remember I mentioned a couple of things when we try to measure the benefits. In this case, usually we can group them in several large groups. One of the biggest group will be, for example, let's say price convergence market integration. That's actually the immediate effect on the producer and consumer surplus. But we can have also additional effect benefits resulting from environmental, for example, reduction of environmental emissions, or for example, for security of supply. And ideally, for example, you can say on the environmental, for example, emissions, you can say that you're trying to measure the benefits via the avoided cost of these emissions. And then what can be done actually is just to look at really the level of emissions and just to find a price to monetize that. And then here it's getting really difficult, for example, if depends on which emissions you're looking. For example, in several cases, the cost-benefit analysis, especially in the European Union, has been really looking at the CO2 emission reduction. And in this case, actually, you can argue what is really the proper price, whether you look actually the price from the European trading scheme, or you look for kind of shadow price because you believe the European the price of the European trading scheme is too low. Yeah. And depends, I mean, if you're, for example, using cost-benefit analysis in other countries, when we don't have really this actually strong, clearly environmental control in terms of emissions, for example, the so-called large combustion directive, then in this case, probably you have to look also at additional emissions, like, for example, CO2 in leaks and other, yeah? Depends on really the environmental legislation in the country. But for sure, this question cannot be addressed in 1 minute. It's one of the most interesting questions, actually, how to really monetize the cost of emissions. Could be also not only not only air emissions, could be also soil emissions, other things. Just how to internalize them also and to monetize them and to internalize them in the cost-benefit analysis. The same is, for example, also of the security of supply. You can argue to some extent that, for example, if you're improving security of supply, you kind of, let's say, improving really the whole reliability, and in this case also you're avoiding cost of future outages. In this case, you have to monetize the cost of outages. It means the electricity of kilowatt hour of electricity, which will be not really kind of, let's say, which will actually not miss to be supplied, so it will be supplied because we have to increase the system reliability. You need really just again the measure what is the cost of electricity outage, so the value of loss load in this case.
Okay,
in terms of preferences, there are several. I think we've done one study recently for the secretariat, but it's actually not published. We've been using some values there. I think I have, especially for the non-environmental value of loss load, have several studies from the past which have been kind of, let's say, used in different cases for different regulations or analysis. Yeah, I can have a look whether I have them still in my computer to send them to Alejandro. Yeah.
Okay, great. In such case, maybe Alejandro can just drop you a line to the email address indicated here,
Yeah.
so this can be more easily done.
Yeah.
Excellent. I also would have a question quite in line with the previous one. So just to make sure whether on the cost-benefit analysis, items like loss reduction or avoided infrastructure are effectively considered.
Actually, that is also part of the benefits, Fernando. It's interesting if you go for kind of, let's say, kind of cost-benefit analysis, for example, for capital expenditures. In this case, it will be interesting to really just look at the overwhelming, really, benefits, and loss reduction is definitely one of them. And again, you remember from our previous studies, we've done it in this way, that actually the logic is again similar. We're looking first actually what is the physical volume of loss reduction, and then we're monetizing that. And actually, then in this case, it is the monetization again includes really just the expected future electricity prices, wholesale prices, including also the internalized cost of CO2 emissions. In this case, you're getting really the benefits of loss reduction because of this capital real investment. And a proper analysis, it will be just useful to incorporate also this loss reduction because it's a benefit which is coming from the investment.
Okay. Okay, great. I would have, meanwhile, another question. It's probably too early, but for these innovation incentives being put in place in UK and Italy, is there any feedback available today?
I think it's in UK. I don't have now really just latest development, but they have already not only with Trio, they have it also before that. And actually, this is a more multiple scheme. It was kind of, let's say, overwhelming scheme. On one side, using really funding, so kind of, let's say, you can say competition for innovation. So it means actually really external funds, governmental funds, I think, which have been managed by Ofgem in this case, for specific projects on competitive basis. So companies apply with their innovation projects just to really receive these funds. And on the other side also was really just specific allowance in terms of really financial allowance of revenues just for the companies, just to, let's say, to go for commercial and technology research. I don't have really proper statistics to say yes or no what has been done, but I think there is a significant experience, yeah, on this one. And Italy, I think it's more related to really just elements of WACC markups for specific investments, at least to my knowledge.
Okay, great. Okay, excellent. So I think there are no further questions. So I thank you very much to you, Konstantin, for this great presentation today. Very informative, very dense. So I think we will need to go back to the slides and have another look, as there are many things inside. So thank you for this content. Also, thank you to our audience for being there, submitting questions, and following this introductory module. So this is the third and last session of the basics of regulation. So from now we will start delivering sessions on concrete aspects of the Clean Energy Regulators Initiative, and usually provided by active players of the regulation landscape. Okay, so thank you very much, Konstantin. I let you the floor to close the session.
Many thanks, Fernando, and also just to the audience today, just to listen to this presentation, capital expenditures, and it was a great pleasure actually. And I think with these 3 lectures, Fernando, we managed again to kind of, let's say, to cover some really essential topics, starting from price control, efficiency analysis, and now looking at the capital expenditures. And I think a bit just to create a bit more awareness of the, let's say, importance of regulatory policy, regulatory arrangements in all these specific areas. And again, on my side, just to thank you very much, also for the great organization of these webinars, and also for the active participation of the colleagues in the last 3 sessions. And just, I mean, happy again to communicate per email, and also somehow, just if people have some more questions after these sessions. And again, many thanks to all of us.